Chapter 1. A Gift Wrapped in Chains. The Great Hall of Lord Vorek's fortress was a monument to excess, a sprawling chamber of polished black stone, illuminated by floating orbs of plasma light that cast eerie shadows against the towering walls. Massive banners of conquered worlds hung like silent trophies, displaying the warlord's brutal victories for all to see. Darius Holt sat at the central table, surrounded by aliens of terrifying strength and stature, their scaled bodies, metallic exoskeletons, and glowing eyes marking them as elite warriors of the Vorkan Dominion. He was the only human in the room, and all eyes were on him. A human ambassador among a council of warlords was unheard of, but Darius had learned that diplomacy wasn't about comfort, was about power. And right now, he had none. He had come here to negotiate a trade treaty, to ensure that human colonies on the frontier weren't wiped out by Vorkan raiding fleets. The Vorkan, after all, were not known for peaceful resolutions. They respected strength, not words. Lord Vorek, a towering beast of a man, with dark red scales, horns curled back like a crown, and molten gold eyes, leaned forward on his massive throne, his clawed fingers tapping against the armrest. "You have spoken well, human Holt," Vorek said, his deep, rumbling voice carrying through the chamber. "Your people wish for peace, and while I find humans weak and short-lived, I am willing to entertain your proposal." Darius kept his expression neutral. He had dealt with warlords before. They didn't give things for free. There was always a price. Vorek smirked, revealing razor-sharp fangs. "And so, as a sign of my generosity, I offer you a gift." A massive set of doors groaned open at the far end of the hall. The moment Darius saw what was inside, his stomach twisted. A woman was led forward shackled in chains. She was not Vorkan. Her skin was a deep, iridescent blue, marked with faint golden patterns that shimmered like living tattoos beneath the dim lighting. Her silver-white hair cascaded over her shoulders, framing high cheekbones, full lips, and piercing violet eyes that burned with something between rage and resignation. She was beautiful, and she was a prisoner. Vorek's smirk widened. "Her name is Zalzyra, a rare specimen, one of the last of her kind, taken from a world that no longer exists." He gestured lazily toward her, as if she were a mere object to be appraised. "She is yours." Darius's jaw clenched. He had expected many things from this mission. Slavery was not one of them. A test of character. Zalzyra stood perfectly still, her wrists bound in energy cuffs, her chin held high despite the weight of her shackles. She did not beg. She did not plead. She merely watched Darius with unreadable violet eyes, waiting to see what kind of man he was. Vorek leaned back in his throne. A gift worthy of a representative of the Terran Union, no? Darius felt every eye in the room turn toward him, waiting for his reaction. He was in enemy territory, surrounded by warriors who saw mercy as weakness. If he refused the gift outright, it could be taken as an insult or worse, a sign that humans lacked the will to rule. If he accepted, however, he would be no better than them. His fingers curled into fists. Zalzyra wasn't just a gift. She was a test. A calculated move to see if humans could be lured by power, if Darius would accept dominance over another being the way the Vorkan did. And yet, despite her situation, despite the golden collar around her neck, despite the chains, she did not look at him with fear. Only expectation. She was waiting for him to be just like the others. Darius inhaled sharply, then turned back to Vorek with calm precision. "A generous offering, Lord Vorek," he said smoothly, "but I do not take slaves." The room went silent. Several Vorkan growled lowly, the sound like rolling thunder. Some looked at Darius as if he had just offended the gods themselves. Vorek arched a brow, his golden eyes narrowing. "You refuse my gift?" Darius forced himself to smile, though his pulse pounded in his ears. He had to play this carefully. "I do not refuse," he said, his voice carrying across the chamber. "I claim her." Murmurs spread through the hall. Darius took a step forward, his gaze steady. "But not as a slave. She will not serve me. She will stand beside me." And then, with a boldness that shocked even himself, he said the words that would change his fate forever. "She is not my possession. She is my bride." A dangerous game. A long, heavy silence fell over the hall. Darius felt the weight of every gaze upon him, the tension thick as steel wire. Then, Vorek laughed. A deep, booming sound that rattled the walls. "You amuse me, human," the warlord said, shaking his head. "You reject power, yet still seek to claim something as your own." Darius held his ground. "I seek no ownership, only a partnership." Vorek's eyes gleamed. "And do you truly think an enslaved woman will be grateful to you? Do you believe she will fall at your feet for granting her freedom?" Darius didn't look at Vorek. He looked at Zalzyra, and in her violet eyes, he saw something he hadn't expected, the faintest flicker of surprise. Not trust, not yet, but something close to it. And for now, that was enough. Vorek studied them for a long moment, then smirked. "Very well, human Holt," he said, leaning back. "Let it be known that this woman is no longer a slave, but a consort to the Terran envoy." His fangs gleamed. "It will be most interesting to see how she feels about that." Darius exhaled slowly as the tension in the room eased. He had survived the moment, but he had just painted a target on his back. And now? Now, he had a wife. One who might very well hate him, and one who, if he wasn't careful, could cost him his life. Chapter 2. Bound by choice, not chains. The moment they left the great hall of Lord Vorek's fortress, the weight of what had just happened settled on Darius Holt's shoulders like a ship's hull pressurizing in deep space. He had made a bold declaration, one that had kept him alive in that room, but it had also chained his fate to a woman who had no reason to trust him. Zalzyra walked ahead of him, her back straight, her silver-white hair flowing behind her like liquid starlight, her wrists still encased in glowing energy cuffs. She had not spoken a single word since he had claimed her as his bride. He had expected anger, resentment, perhaps even outright hostility. Instead, she was silent, calculating. It was worse. As they entered the private chambers that had been assigned to them, a lavish suite with Vorkan architecture, curved metal walls pulsing with dim blue lights, alien runes carved into the high ceiling, Darius finally spoke. "You can take those off," he said, nodding toward her restraints. Zalzyra turned her piercing violet gaze to him, and for the first time, she truly looked at him. Not as her captor, not as another master, but as a puzzle she had yet to solve. She lifted her hands, the faint blue glow of the shackles casting ghostly light over her skin. Her delicate fingers flexed against the bonds, as if she barely acknowledged them. "You say this," she murmured, her voice soft yet edged with steel, "yet you still allow me to wear them." Darius stepped forward, reaching for the control panel embedded in the wall. With a few precise keystrokes, the restraints deactivated with a soft chime, vanishing into thin air. Her hands fell to her sides. She did not rub her wrists. She did not thank him. She only tilted her head slightly, as if waiting for him to explain why he had done it. Darius sighed, running a hand through his short-cropped brown hair. "I don't do chains, Zalzyra." Her lips parted slightly at the sound of her name from his mouth, as if it had never been spoken without ownership attached to it. He leaned against the smooth wall, watching her carefully. "I meant what I said back there. You're not a slave. Not to me." Zalzyra remained quiet, watching him the way a soldier watches an unfamiliar enemy. Then she spoke again, this time, with the hint of a challenge. "You do not claim me as a slave, yet you claimed me as a bride. Tell me, human Holt, which is worse?" Darius exhaled slowly, letting the question settle. He understood what she meant. The galaxy was not kind to the weak. Women, men, entire species, if they were conquered, they became commodities. It was rare for someone to be given as a gift, without expectation. "You think I traded one cage for another," he murmured. "Did you not?" she countered, stepping closer. Her voice was calm, controlled, but beneath the surface, he sensed the fury she refused to show outright. "You did not reject Lord Vorek's offer," she continued. "You did not say, 'No, I do not take this woman at all.' You claimed me instead. Why?" Darius held her gaze, refusing to back down. "Because if I had refused, someone else would have taken you," he said plainly. "And I don't trust anyone in that room not to have done worse." Something flickered in her eyes. Not trust. Not yet, but something close. She exhaled, as if trying to process this reality. "So then tell me, Holt, what happens now?" Darius glanced at the suite's central command panel, checking the security feed. Vorkan guards still roamed the halls outside, keeping watch. They were being observed, their every move analyzed. "We play the part," he said, his voice low. "For now." She arched a delicate brow. "You wish to pretend we are bonded?" Darius crossed his arms. "I wish to make sure you stay alive." Zalzyra studied him carefully. Then, to his complete surprise, she smirked. It was the first emotion she had shown that wasn't guarded neutrality. "A human warrior," she mused, "concerned for my survival." Her violet eyes glowed faintly in the dim room. "Tell me, Holt, how long do you think we can keep up this illusion?" Darius let out a short, breathless laugh. "I guess we'll find out." But in the pit of his stomach, he already knew the answer. Not long at all. A silent war begins. That night, they shared a room. Not the same bed. Zalzyra had made it clear she would sleep on the opposite end of the suite, watching him from a distance. Darius had respected that. Even if the guards outside expected them to be playing the role of a proper couple, neither of them tried to force it. But sleep was a fleeting thing. Hours later, as the ambient lights dimmed and the Vorkan city outside pulsed with neon blue energy, Darius found himself lying awake, staring at the metal ceiling. Across the room, Zalzyra sat awake as well. She had moved to a small alcove, her knees drawn up, her arms resting over them. She was watching the night sky through the open window, silent and still. "You don't sleep much," Darius said quietly. She didn't look at him, but she replied after a pause. "Slaves do not have the luxury of dreams," she murmured. A bitter statement, one that made Darius's chest tighten. He sat up slowly, resting his elbows on his knees. "You're not a slave anymore." She tilted her head slightly, as if contemplating his words. Then, at last, she spoke again. "You truly believe that?" Darius nodded. "Yeah, I do." Zalzyra finally turned to look at him, studying his face carefully as if trying to determine whether he was a fool, a liar, or something else entirely. After a long silence, she exhaled and turned back toward the stars. "We shall see, human Holt," she said softly. But for the first time, her voice no longer carried the weight of chains. Chapter 3. Between Freedom and Obligation. The next morning, Zalzyra did something she had not done in years. She walked without chains. For so long, shackles had dictated her movements, pulling her from one master to the next, each claiming ownership, each deciding her fate for her. She had learned to walk with measured steps, always aware of how her captors viewed her, careful never to invite more pain than necessary. But today, no chains, no collar digging into her skin. She could not decide if it felt liberating or terrifying. Darius Holt stood beside her, leading her down the grand corridors of Lord Vorek's fortress. The Vorkan warlord had insisted that they join him for a morning audience, a continued charade of diplomacy and power games. Zalzyra stole a glance at the human who had upended everything she knew. He had not tried to touch her, had not tried to force affection from her, despite his bold declaration the night before. He had not treated her as a possession, nor had he expected gratitude. She had waited for the moment when his true intentions would be revealed, when he would finally demand something in return for his so-called mercy. But it had never come, and that made him more dangerous than any master she had known. Not because he wielded a whip, but because he was something far more unpredictable. He was kind, and in this world, kindness was a lie waiting to turn into a weapon. A table of wolves. The banquet hall was alive with murmured conversations, the air thick with the scent of roasted meats, exotic spices, and the metallic tang of Vorkan liquor. Darius and Zalzyra were seated near the center of the long stone table, directly across from Lord Vorek himself. It was a deliberate placement. Darius had no illusions about why they had been summoned here. This was not a simple gathering. This was a test. The Vorkan lords wanted to see if the human ambassador and his newly claimed bride could truly play their part. Vorek leaned back in his massive chair, his golden eyes gleaming with quiet amusement. "You seem to have tamed her well, human Holt," he rumbled, tearing a chunk of meat from the bone with his sharp fangs. "I expected more resistance from such a proud species." Zalzyra felt her fingers twitch beneath the table. She had spent years enduring such talk, and yet this was different, because she was no longer helpless. Darius's expression remained unreadable, but his hand casually reached for his drink, swirling the thick, violet Vorkan ale within the goblet. You misunderstand, Lord Vorek, he said, his voice calm, almost casual. I don't tame anyone. My people don't believe in that sort of thing. Several Vorkan warriors chuckled darkly, the sound like rolling thunder. Vorek smirked, tilting his head. Ah yes, the fabled human morals. How charmingly naive. He took another bite of his meal, chewing thoughtfully before his gaze slid to Zalzyra. And what do you say, my dear? He mused. Do you feel liberated by your new master's kindness? Zalzyra's grip tightened around the stem of her glass. This was a trap. She knew this game. Vorek was testing her. If she spoke too softly, she would be seen as a weak woman who had simply traded one master for another. If she spoke too boldly, she would be seen as disobedient, and that could put Darius in danger. Every part of her wanted to lash out, to tear away the illusion, to make it clear that she was no one's property no matter what they called her. But then, she saw Darius. Saw the calm way he watched her, waiting, not commanding, not forcing, just trusting her to choose her own words. And that, more than anything, angered her. Not at him, at herself. Because in that moment, for the first time in years, she did not know what she wanted. She took a slow breath, raised her glass, and met Vorek's gaze head-on. I would rather be bound by choice, she said softly, than by chains. The hall went silent. Vorek's lips curled in interest. Huh, a clever answer. Darius hid his smirk behind his drink. Zalzyra set her goblet down, her pulse steady, controlled. But inside, she knew that she had just drawn a line in the sand. For the first time in a very long time, her fate was in her own hands. And that was terrifying. A quiet battle between them. After the banquet, Darius and Zalzyra returned to their private quarters. The moment the heavy doors slid shut behind them, she turned to him, crossing her arms. You did not correct him, she said. Darius leaned against the edge of the console near the window, arms crossed, watching her with mild curiosity. Correct him about what? Zalzyra's violet eyes narrowed. You let him assume we were bonded. He arched a brow. Would you have preferred I call him a liar in front of his war council? Her fingers twitched. She hated that he was right, but she hated even more that she didn't know how to feel about it. You are playing a dangerous game, Holt, she said quietly. His smirk faded, his expression turning serious. And you're part of it now, whether you like it or not. She took a slow step forward, watching him. Why are you doing this? His jaw tightened for just a fraction of a second, enough for her to see something hidden behind his composed exterior. Darius sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. Because I refuse to let them win. Her brow furrowed. Who? The ones who think that power is about ownership, that strength is about breaking others down. He exhaled, shaking his head. I've seen too much of that already. Zalzyra studied him for a long moment. Something shifted between them. She still did not trust him, but for the first time, she wondered if he was just as much of a prisoner in this world as she was. She turned away, moving toward the window. I still do not believe in your kindness, Holt, she murmured. He chuckled softly. Good. Keeps things interesting. A small, reluctant smirk tugged at the corner of her lips. She quickly erased it, because if she let herself believe in him, she didn't know if she'd ever be able to walk away. Chapter 4. The Chains We Choose. The air was thick with tension, a silent storm that stretched between Darius Holt and Zalzyra as they sat across from each other in their dimly lit quarters. It had been days since the banquet where she had spoken freely, since she had stepped into the role of consort, rather than slave. And yet, every moment since had felt like walking a knife's edge. Zalzyra had been a captive for most of her life, and now, she was something else. Not a prisoner. Not yet free. Caught in an illusion of choice, one she wasn't sure she should embrace or destroy. Darius hadn't pushed her. That was what unsettled her most. He had let her be. He hadn't tried to own her, control her, mold her into what he needed. And that was dangerous, because part of her did not know how to exist without a master. And the other part of her wanted to burn down the world that made her think that way. She took a slow breath, watching him from across the room. You're waiting for me to decide, she murmured. Darius glanced at her over the rim of his drink, leaning against the edge of the console with his usual calm demeanor. I don't need a decision from you, Zyra. It was the first time he had spoken her name without her full title. Her fingers curled slightly at the sound of it. You do not want control? She asked, tilting her head slightly. No claim? No assurance? Darius smirked, but it was tired. I didn't take you from Vorek just to keep you under my rule, he said plainly. A long silence stretched between them. And then, finally, you are a fool, Darius Holt. Darius chuckled, taking a sip of his drink. Yeah, I get that a lot. For the first time, Zalzyra didn't disagree. The storm breaks. The next morning, the illusion shattered. It happened with a single knock on their chamber door. Darius moved first, reaching for his sidearm precaution, because nothing good ever came from an unannounced visit in a warlord's stronghold. Zalzyra stood tense beside him, her violet eyes unreadable. The doors slid open, revealing a Vorkan guard, his heavy armor gleaming under the dim corridor lights. His slit-pupil eyes locked onto Zalzyra first. The warlord has summoned you. Zalzyra's spine went rigid. Darius stepped between them, his stance casual, yet undeniably firm. She doesn't go anywhere alone. The guard let out a low growl, but did not argue. Then both of you will come. A chill crept through Darius's blood. This wasn't normal. Something had changed. And whatever it wasn't good. Betrayal in the throne room. The Grand Hall felt different this time. Darker. The gathered warlords and elites were watching. Their gazes sharp, predatory. Lord Vorek sat at the head of the chamber, his golden eyes gleaming with something unreadable. And then Darius saw why they had been summoned. A man stood near the throne. A human. And not just any human. Ambassador Rennick Vaughn. Darius's stomach turned to stone. Rennick was a high-ranking diplomat from the Terran Union. A man who had opposed Darius from the start, calling him reckless, calling his methods dangerous. And now? Now, he was here, standing beside Lord Vorek. Betrayal burned through Darius's veins. The warlord leaned forward, resting his massive clawed hands on the stone throne. Your people, Holt, Vorek rumbled, do not agree with your choices. Rennick smiled. We're here to correct an error. Zalzyra's breath hitched beside him. Darius's grip on his sidearm tightened. You sold me out, he said, his voice low, steady. Rennick didn't even bother denying it. Bringing a former slave into political affairs? Rennick scared. That was always going to be a problem. The Union can't afford reckless moves like that. Darius exhaled sharply. You're scared, he realized. Scared that letting Zalzyra stand as an equal would make your kind look weak to the Vorkan. Vorek let out a rumbling chuckle. Rennick ignored it. The Terran Union cannot allow this farce to continue, Rennick continued, stepping forward. You've put us in a dangerous position, Holt. And so, you will step down from this mission. You will renounce any claims you've made to this woman. Zalzyra went rigid beside him. And for the first time, Darius felt it. Real anger from her. Not passive resistance. Not subtle defiance. This was rage. Because after all this time, after all the chains, they were trying to take away the first choice she had ever been given. Darius turned back to Rennick and smirked. You really don't know me at all, do you? Rennick's smile faltered. Darius reached for his gun dash, and the room exploded into chaos. Freedom bought with fire. Blaster fire ripped through the chamber. Zalzyra moved like lightning, taking down 2 Vorkan guards before they even realized what was happening. Darius shot 3 more, their armor sparking as their bodies crashed into the ground. Rennick shouted orders, but Vorek only laughed. The warlord did not intervene. He only watched. Because in his eyes, this was not a political disaster. This was entertainment. Zalzyra spun, her hands grabbing the hilt of a fallen guard's blade, her violet eyes blazing with fury. Darius shot another soldier in the leg, sending him crashing to the floor. Rennick stumbled backward, eyes wide. You're making a mistake, Holt. Darius grinned. No, Rennick. You did. He turned to Zalzyra. You ready? She gripped the blade, breathing heavily, her expression unreadable. Then, at last dash, she smiled. And for the first time, Darius knew she had chosen him. Not because she was forced, not because she had no other options, but because she had decided for herself. They ran. And behind them, Lord Vorek's laughter boomed through the chamber like thunder. Epilogue. The flight to the stars. They made it off-world. The stolen Vorkan cruiser shot through the void, the stars stretching long and bright as they broke through the outer defenses of the warlord's territory. Darius sat at the controls, his breath ragged, exhausted. Beside him, Zalzyra stood, her gaze fixed on the stars ahead. "So," he muttered, running a hand through his hair, "where do you want to go?" She turned to him, her violet eyes brighter than ever. "Somewhere I can choose." Darius grinned. "Then let's start with anywhere but here." The ship jumped to light speed, and for the first time in her life, Zalzyra was free.